Grace Collins had her boot heel wedged against the dam gate's iron crank when she heard the first timber crack, and she knew in her bones it was no accident of weather or time. "Someone has sawed through the brace," she said aloud, though there was no one on the bank of the Loup River to hear her but the meadowlarks and the mules tied to the wagon behind her. She dropped to her knees in the mud, running her fingers along the wooden support that held back the diverted channel feeding the new stage stop's mill pond, the one her Uncle Henrik had spent 3 summers building with his own hands, and the help of every Bohemian and German family within 20 miles. The cut was clean, deliberate, made with a fine-toothed saw and hidden beneath a smear of river clay so that no casual eye would catch it. Whoever had done this had wanted the dam to hold just long enough. Long enough for what? She did not yet know, but the water pressing behind the weakened brace told her it would not hold much longer. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked west along the rail grade that the Union Pacific's contractors had been laying through this stretch of the Nebraska prairie all that golden July of 1869. The very same grade that ran within a quarter-mile of the trestle bridge crossing the river just below the dam. If the water broke through here, it would not simply flood the Collins bottomland. It would undercut the new trestle's footings, and there was a supply train due through that crossing before dark, its whistle already a faint promise on the wind whenever the breeze came right. Grace Collins had crossed an ocean at 19 with her mother's Bible and her father's rifle and precious little else, and she had learned in the years since that the difference between a girl who survived the frontier and one who did not was often nothing more than the willingness to act in the half-second before certainty arrived. She did not wait for certainty now. She swung up onto her mare and put her heels to its flanks, riding hard along the grade toward the work camp, shouting the whole way for someone, anyone, to hear her. The man who heard her first was Roscoe Ford, foreman of the Western tracklaying gang, standing atop a flat car with a level in his hand and sweat darkening the back of his shirt in the shape of a map to nowhere. He turned at the sound of a horse coming on too fast for a Tuesday afternoon and saw a woman with dark hair loosed from its pins, riding astride in a manner that would have scandalized the ladies back in his mother's Ohio parlor, and he did not think about scandal at all. He thought only that something was badly wrong, because women on this stretch of prairie did not ride like that unless the world behind them was ending. "The dam above the trestle," she called out while still 30 yards off, her accent softening some vowels and sharpening others, Bohemian beneath American. "Someone has cut the brace. It will not hold." The supply train. Roscoe did not wait for the rest of the sentence. He was already down off the flat car, already shouting for Dutchy Kraft to ride the message south to the section boss and stop that train if it had not yet cleared the last siding, already reaching for the rope coiled at his saddle. As he swung up onto the gray gelding, he kept picketed near the work camp for exactly this kind of trouble, though he had imagined the trouble as a broken axle or a rattlesnake in the supply tent. Never sabotage. "Show me," he said, and Grace turned her mare without another word, and the two of them rode hard for the river. The dam was worse than she had left it. In the few minutes she had been gone, the crack in the timber had spread, and water was finding new paths through the gap in dark, insistent fingers, each one widening as it went. Roscoe took one look at the strain on the remaining braces and understood the mathematics of disaster as well as any man who had spent 6 years building things meant to hold weight and water and the whole unforgiving pressure of the world. "We cannot patch that," he said. "Not in the time we have." "Then we open the spillway gate all the way and let it run controlled instead of wild," Grace said, already moving toward the crank she had abandoned minutes before. "It will flood the low pasture, but it will take the pressure off the trestle footings." He looked at her with something between admiration and disbelief, because most men he knew, faced with a wall of water threatening a bridge, would have simply run for the bridge to warn people off it, and never thought first of the engineering that might save the bridge itself. but she was already hauling on the crank, and after a heartbeat, he threw his weight beside hers, and together they turned the great iron wheel until the spillway gate groaned open, and the river found its new, wider mouth, spreading out across the low pasture in a brown sheet that would ruin a season's hay but would not touch the trestle at all. They stood there afterward, both soaked to the knees, both breathing hard, and the timber dam settled with a long, tired sigh as the pressure came off it, holding for now, though barely. "That was clever," Roscoe said, and then, because he could not help himself, and reckless. "You might have drowned turning that crank alone before I got here." "I did not drown," Grace pointed out, "because I did not wait to be rescued before I acted, Mr. Ford. There was no time for anything else." "Roscoe," he said, "not Mr. Nobody out here bothers with Mr. And after this I think we have gone and skipped past strangers entirely." She almost smiled at that, he thought, though she covered it quickly, turning to look at the mud where the cut brace had been, her expression going hard and thoughtful again. "Someone did this on purpose," she said. "And whoever did, they knew that train was coming through today. They knew, and they wanted the bridge to fail while it crossed." Roscoe felt the cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the river water soaking his boots. He had heard whispers for weeks now among the track-laying crews, murmurs about the Sloan gang, and the toll they charged on the only road south to the railhead at Kearney, about payments made quietly by certain officials of the Union Pacific to look the other way when freight went missing, or when certain contracts for timber and iron went to certain suppliers at prices no honest man would pay. He had not wanted to believe corruption ran high enough to touch the trestle itself, the very bones of the railroad he had given years of his life to building. But a sabotage dam timed to a supply train's crossing was not the work of a drunk cowhand with a grudge. It was the work of men who understood schedules, who had access to the work camp's manifests, who wanted something worse than a delay. "We need to see who benefits," Grace said, echoing his own thought before he could voice it, "if the train is destroyed or delayed long enough that another route becomes necessary. Who controls that other route?" "The Sloan gang runs the toll road south through Ash Hollow," Roscoe said slowly. "If the rail crossing here fails and stays failed, every wagon of freight and every family headed toward the railhead has to go through Sloan's toll gate instead, and pay whatever he asks, and take whatever risk of losing goods or worse along the way." "And who," Grace asked, her dark eyes steady on him, "receives a share of that toll?" Neither of them said the name aloud yet, because neither of them had proof, only the shape of a suspicion forming in the golden afternoon light. But they both understood that they had stumbled, quite by accident, into something far larger than a broken dam. Dutchy Craft came pounding back along the grade within the hour with word that the supply train had been flagged down at the last siding, 3 miles south. Its engineer warned in time. The immediate danger had passed. But Roscoe Ford did not feel any easing of the tightness in his chest, because he understood now that the danger had only changed its shape, from a wall of water to something colder and more patient, something that would try again. He rode with Grace back toward the Collins homestead as the sun slanted long and amber across the prairie grass, and he found himself in no particular hurry to close the distance, though he told himself it was only prudent to see her home safely after what had happened. "You farm the bottomland along here," he said, more statement than question, because he had seen the neat rows of her family's corn from the grade for weeks now without knowing whose hands had planted them. "My Uncle Henrik came from Bohemia 12 years ago," Grace said. "My mother and I followed after my father died 3 years back now. We have built something here that no one gave to us, and no one has any right to take from us, Mr. Ford, and I will tell you plainly, if this sabotage was meant to drive families like mine off this land by making the roads impossible and the water undependable, it will not work." "Roscoe," he corrected again, gently. "And I do not doubt your resolve for one moment, Miss Collins. I have seen enough of it in one afternoon to last a lifetime." She glanced at him sideways then, and there was something warmer in her face than there had been before, something that might have been the beginning of trust, though she guarded it carefully, the way a person guards anything they have learned the hard way to protect. "You said you were riding through to check the grade today," she said. "Is that your usual work, or did something send you out this direction particular?" "I have been checking every mile of grade twice a week since the spring," Roscoe admitted. "There have been small things. Survey stakes moved. A culvert filled with gravel that should have drained clean. Nothing so large as today, but enough that I started keeping a private ledger of where and when, hoping to find a pattern before I brought it to anyone above me. Why not bring it to your superiors already?" He was quiet a moment, choosing his words with the same care he gave to leveling a rail. "Because two of the men above me are the same men who sign off on supply contracts, and I have noticed those contracts go disproportionately to outfits that operate out of Ash Hollow. I did not want to accuse a man of corruption on the strength of coincidence alone. I wanted proof." "Then perhaps," Grace said, "we should look for it together. I have as much reason as you do, Mr. Ford, and a farmer's eye for things that do not add up in a ledger." "Roscoe," he said a third time, and this time she did smile just slightly, just enough that he felt it land somewhere behind his ribs like a stone dropped into still water. They reached the Collins homestead as the light was failing, a modest sod-roofed house and a barn built from lumber hauled at great expense from the railhead, with rows of corn and wheat stretching green and gold in the last sun, and a garden where Grace's mother Ainska was kneeling among the beans, and a boy of perhaps 12, Grace's young cousin Pavel, chasing a hen that had gotten loose from the coop. Ainska rose at the sound of hooves, her hand shading her eyes, and Grace called out to her in Czech, a quick reassurance that all was well, before switching back to English for Roscoe's benefit. "My mother does not speak much English yet," she explained. "She understands more than she lets on, I think, but the words come slower for her than for me. I was younger when we crossed." "There is no shame in that," Roscoe said, and meant it, and Ainska must have understood something of his tone if not his words, because her wary expression eased somewhat as she studied him. Henrik Novik, Grace's uncle, came from the barn wiping grease from his hands on a rag, a broad, sun-browned man with Grace's same steady dark eyes, and when Grace explained what had happened at the dam, his face went through several colors before settling on a grim, weathered calm that Roscoe recognized from other men who had survived hard things before and expected to survive this too. "Sloan," Henrik said, the name dropping into the conversation like a stone into a well. "It is always Sloan, one way or another, since he set up his toll gate at Ash Hollow 2 years back. First it was the road tax we could not refuse to pay. Then it was cattle that went missing from the herds of families who complained too loud about the tax. Now it is dams. You cannot know for certain it was his gang," Roscoe said, though even as he said it, he did not fully believe his own caution. "No," Henrik agreed. "We cannot know for certain, but we know the shape of the thing, Mr. Ford, even without the proof, and a man does not survive 12 years on this prairie by ignoring the shape of things." Grace's mother had gone inside during this exchange, and now returned bearing a plate of bread and soft cheese and a jug of buttermilk, setting it on the porch rail without a word, her way of saying that whatever else was true, guests would be fed, and Roscoe found himself unexpectedly moved by the gesture, by the whole practical, hard-won dignity of this family clinging to their patch of prairie against forces that would grind them down if they let it. He stayed longer than he had planned, eating bread with cheese and drinking buttermilk gone cool from the spring house, listening to Henrik describe the toll road and the men who worked it, a hard crew of perhaps 15 riders led by a man named Amos Sloan, who had once ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war, and had brought that same casual brutality west when the fighting ended. Sloan's toll gate sat astride the only reliable crossing of Ash Hollow Creek for 20 miles in either direction, a natural choke point that he had fortified with a low sod wall and a swinging gate of iron chain, and any farmer or freighter who wanted to reach the railhead at Kearney without adding 2 days and considerable risk to their journey had no choice but to pay whatever toll Sloane's men demanded that week. "And the marshal does nothing?" Roscoe asked. Henrik laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Marshal Cobb rides out from North Platte once a season to collect his own envelope from Sloane's man, and calls it keeping the peace. The county judge, Whitfield, has signed papers granting Sloane's toll operation the appearance of legal standing, some nonsense about a franchise for road maintenance that Sloane has never once performed. No, Mr. Ford, the law here does not oppose Sloane. The law here is paid by Sloane." Roscoe rode back toward the work camp well after dark that night, his mind turning over everything he had learned, and beneath the turning of his mind, something else was turning too, something warmer and less easily catalogued, the memory of Grace Collins standing in the mud with her hands on that iron crank, unafraid, deciding in an instant to save a bridge she had never been asked to save. He told himself it was admiration only, the natural respect one capable person feels for another. He was not entirely successful in believing his own explanation. Over the following days, Roscoe found himself with an unusual number of reasons to ride the grade past the Collins bottomland. The dam needed watching, he told himself, in case the sabotage had weakened more than the one brace. The trestle footings needed checking after the flood, though the flood had been controlled and shallow, and any fool could see the footings stood sound. There was a culvert half a mile from the Collins property that he had been meaning to inspect for weeks, he told himself, though he had in fact inspected it thoroughly not 10 days before. Grace, for her part, noticed the frequency of these visits and said nothing about it directly, though there was a knowing quality to the look she gave him on the third such occasion, when he arrived at midday with some thin excuse about checking the water level, and found her in the cornfield with a hoe, sweat darkening her collar, her sleeves rolled to the elbow in a way that made him lose the thread of his own excuse entirely for a moment. "The water level in the pond has not changed in 3 days, Mr. Ford," she observed, not looking up from her work. "I would think a man as thorough as yourself would have noticed that by now without needing to ride out again." "Roscoe," he said, for what felt like the 10th time, "and perhaps I simply enjoy the ride." "Perhaps," Grace said, and there was that almost smile again, quickly suppressed, and she went back to her hoeing, and he found himself, against all professional sense, picking up a second hoe from where it leaned against the fence and falling into step beside her down the row. "You do not need to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "I am doing it anyway." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the sun warm on their backs, the corn rustling in a light prairie wind, and Roscoe found that he liked the quiet of it more than he had liked almost anything in longer than he could remember, the simple, honest labor of it, so different from the constant calculation and vigilance his railroad work required. "Tell me about Bohemia," he said eventually, because he wanted to know, and because the silence had grown comfortable enough that a question no longer felt like an intrusion. Grace was quiet a moment, her hoe steady in the dark earth. "My father was a schoolteacher there, in a village near Pilsen. He believed in things that the empire did not want believed, small things, that farmers should own the land they worked, that peasants' children deserved to learn to read as much as any noble's child. It made him trouble to certain people. When my mother's brother Henrik wrote from America saying there was land to be had here for those willing to work it, my father sold everything he had and we came. He died 3 years ago, you said. A fever, the second winter after we arrived. He never saw the farm prosper the way it has since. My mother has never quite forgiven this country for taking him after it promised so much, though she would never say so plainly. She works the land because it is what remains of the promise, I think, more than because she loves it." "And you?" Roscoe asked. "Do you love it?" Grace straightened, resting one hand against the small of her back, looking out over the rows of corn stretching green and gold toward the horizon, the wheat beyond it, the low sod roof of the house with smoke curling from its chimney where her mother would be preparing the evening meal. "I did not choose to come here," she said slowly, "but I have chosen, every day since, to stay and make something of it. I think that is its own kind of love, even if it did not start as love. It is not so different, perhaps, from other things that begin as duty and become something more." She glanced at him as she said this last part, and Roscoe felt certain, though he could not have said exactly why, that she was not speaking only of the farm. "I have been thinking," he said, changing the subject before he said something he was not yet ready to say, "that we need proof of Sloane's arrangement with Judge Whitfield and Marshal Cobb before anyone with real authority will act against him. The Union Pacific's district superintendent, a man named Halloran, comes through on an inspection tour in 3 weeks. If we can show him evidence, actual documents, actual testimony, that Sloane is sabotaging railroad property to drive traffic toward his toll road, and that local officials are complicit, Halloran has the authority to bring in federal marshals." 3 weeks, Grace said. "That is a long time for Sloane's gang to try again and succeed before we have anything to show anyone." "I know," Roscoe said. "Which is why I intend to keep watching the grade and keep that private ledger and find whatever proof I can before then. But I do not intend to do it alone if you are willing to help. You know this country better than I do. You know which families have suffered under Sloane's toll and might be willing to speak if they believed speaking would actually change something." Grace considered this for a long moment, her hoe forgotten in her hands. "There is a woman, Ingrid Larson, whose husband was killed 2 summers back when he refused to pay Sloane's toll and tried to ford the creek elsewhere. Sloane's men shot him from the bank, called it an accident, and the marshal accepted that explanation without so much as riding out to look at the body. Ingrid has never spoken of it to anyone official out of fear, but she has spoken of it to me, more than once, over quilting and coffee. If she believed testifying would bring justice rather than more grief, I think she might be willing." "That is a start," Roscoe said. "A good one." "There are others too," Grace said, warming to the idea now, her eyes bright with purpose. "Families who have kept records of tolls paid, dates, and amounts, because farmers are careful people about money even when they are afraid to speak of anything else. If we gathered those records together, alongside your ledger of sabotage, alongside Ingrid's testimony, we might have something Superintendent Halloran cannot ignore." "We might," Roscoe agreed, and found himself smiling at her, a real smile, unguarded, and she smiled back before catching herself and looking quickly down at the corn row, but not before he saw it, and the seeing of it settled something warm and certain in his chest that had nothing at all to do with railroads or evidence or justice, and everything to do with the particular, specific fact of Grace Collins standing in a cornfield in the golden Nebraska light. Over the following 2 weeks, they built their case together, riding out in the early mornings before Roscoe's shift began or in the evenings after it ended, visiting the scattered farms and stage-stop families who had suffered under Sloane's toll. Ingrid Larson wept when she spoke of her husband but agreed, in the end, to write down what she had seen. The Vaclavics, a family 3 farms over, produced a small ledger book recording every toll payment they had made for 2 years, dates and amounts that lined up with alarming precision against the pattern of sabotage Roscoe had documented along the rail grade, as though Sloane's gang timed their railroad mischief to coincide with periods when they needed to squeeze more traffic onto the toll road to cover some debt or another. Roscoe found, too, a survey stake that had been deliberately moved 18 inches, enough to throw off a culvert's drainage calculation, just enough to cause slow, cumulative damage rather than immediate catastrophe, the kind of sabotage that would look, to a careless inspector, like ordinary settling and erosion rather than deliberate harm. He photographed it, sketched it, measured it with the same care he gave to any legitimate survey, because he understood that if this evidence was ever to matter, it had to be beyond dispute. Through all of this labor, Something else was growing between them that neither had quite named aloud, though both felt its weight in small moments. The way Roscoe's hand found the small of Grace's back to steady her crossing a rocky creek bed, and lingered there a half-second longer than strict necessity required. The way Grace, sitting beside him on the porch rail one evening reviewing the Vaclavic's ledger by lamplight, had leaned her shoulder against his without seeming to notice she had done it, and he had not moved away, had in fact gone very still, as a man does when something precious and unexpected has landed near him and he fears disturbing it. It was on one such evening, the ledger spread between them on the porch table, moths beating soft wings against the lamp glass, that Grace finally said what had been sitting unspoken in her chest for days. "You keep finding reasons to come out here, Roscoe Ford," she said, using his given name at last, deliberately watching for his reaction. "The dam is sound. The culvert is inspected. The evidence is gathered as much as it can be gathered before Halloran arrives, and yet here you are again." He set down the ledger he had been pretending to read. "I could say I am simply thorough." "You could," Grace agreed, "but I do not think that is the whole truth, and I think you know I do not think so." Roscoe was quiet a moment, looking out at the darkening prairie, the first stars pricking through the deep blue overhead, and when he spoke his voice had lost the easy, joking quality it usually carried and gone plain and honest instead. "When this business with Sloane and the ledgers is settled, one way or another, I expect you will go back to thinking of yourself as only passing through, the way you told me you thought of yourself when I first met you at the dam. A farmer with land to defend, not a woman with time to spare for a railroad man who cannot promise you anything certain. And I find that I do not want that to be true, Grace. I find that every reason I have given myself to ride out here has been an excuse to see you a little longer, a little more often, and I think it is past time I stopped pretending otherwise, at least to you, if not to myself." Grace was silent long enough that he feared he had misjudged everything, had read warmth into what had only been practical alliance against a common threat. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and unsteady in a way he had not heard from her before, the sureness she carried into every damn crisis and cornfield argument momentarily set aside. "When I first came to this stage-stop community," she said, "I told myself, and I told my mother that we were only passing through, that we would work this land only until we had saved enough to move on to something better, somewhere the winters were not so hard and the water not so uncertain. That was 5 years ago. I have said the words only passing through so many times that I stopped noticing they were no longer true. This land is not something I am passing through anymore, Roscoe. It is mine, built with my own hands and Henrik's and my mother's. And I find lately that when I imagine my future here, I imagine you in it, more often than I have any right to, for a man I have known only these few weeks." "A few weeks is enough," Roscoe said, "when a person shows you exactly who they are in that time the way you have shown me. I do not need years to know what I feel, Grace. I only need the courage to say it, which I am saying now plainly so there can be no mistaking it. I love you. I did not expect to, and I did not plan for it, and it is likely inconvenient timing given everything with Sloane still unresolved, but there it is." Grace reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers rough with farm work, calloused and strong, lacing through his, and for a long moment neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed saying, the lamp burning low and warm between them, the moths circling, the prairie night settling deep and quiet around the small porch where two people had finally stopped finding excuses and started telling each other the truth. "I am not a woman who needs protecting, Roscoe," Grace said eventually, though gently now, without the edge such words might once have carried. "Whatever comes next with Sloane, I intend to be beside you in it, not behind you, and not shielded from it in some cabin while you take all the risk. If we are to build something together, it has to be built as equals, or it will not hold, any more than that dam held with a sawn brace hidden beneath the mud." "I would not want it any other way," Roscoe said, and meant it fully, though the words would be tested sooner than either of them expected. The test came 4 nights later, and it came in the dark, the way trouble on the frontier so often did. Roscoe had ridden out to the Collins homestead that evening not for any excuse of inspection, but simply because Henrik had invited him to supper, a milestone of its own, the older man's grudging approval having warmed over the preceding weeks into something like genuine welcome. They had eaten well, Ainska's dumplings and roast chicken, and afterward Roscoe and Grace had sat on the porch while Henrik smoked his pipe and young Pavel practiced his letters by lamplight at the kitchen table, and it had felt, for a few hours, like something close to peace. The first sign that peace was ending came as a distant drumming, hoofbeats carried on the still night air from the direction of the toll road, too many horses for any ordinary traveler, moving with the deliberate speed of men who knew exactly where they were going and intended to arrive together. Roscoe was on his feet before the sound had fully registered, some instinct sharpened by weeks of watching for exactly this kind of trouble already moving him toward the barn where the horses were kept, toward the rifle he knew Henrik stored just inside the door. "Sloan," Grace said, standing too, her voice gone tight and careful. "We do not know that for certain," Roscoe said, though he did not believe his own words even as he said them, "but we should not wait to find out." Henrik had come out onto the porch already, pipe abandoned, his own rifle in hand, and Ainska had gathered Pavel close to her inside the doorway, her face pale but composed, the face of a woman who had survived hard things before and would survive this too if survival was to be had. "How many riders?" Henrik asked, listening to the approaching drumming with a farmer's practiced ear for distance and number. 8, perhaps 10, Roscoe said, coming from the toll road direction, which means they know exactly whose farm this is. "They know we have been gathering evidence against Sloan," Grace said, understanding arriving in her voice like cold water. "Someone must have talked, or been seen, or Ingrid's letter was intercepted before it ever reached us. There was no time to determine which, only time to prepare." Roscoe's mind, trained by years of solving practical problems under pressure, the problems of grade and timber and iron, turned now to the problem of defending a homestead against 10 armed riders with only himself, Henrik, and whatever Grace could bring to bear, since Ainska would not leave Pavel's side and could not be asked to fight in any case. "We cannot win a straight fight against 10 riders," Roscoe said, thinking fast. "But we do not need to win a straight fight. We need to make them believe the cost of attacking is higher than they are willing to pay and buy enough time for help to arrive." "What help?" Henrik asked. "There is no one to send for on this stretch of prairie in the dead of night, Mr. Ford, and no time to send even if there were." "There is the stage stop," Grace said suddenly. "The Larkin stage stop 2 miles east. There are always at least 4 or 5 men there this time of year, freighters waiting on the morning stage, hired hands passing through. If we can get word to them." "I can ride there," Roscoe said, "if you can hold the house until I return with help." "No," Grace said immediately, sharply. "You said yourself we do not need a straight fight. If you ride for help, you leave us exactly the straight fight we cannot win, and you risk being caught on open ground by riders who move faster than you in the dark on unfamiliar terrain. There is a better way." "Tell me," Roscoe said, and there was no argument in his voice now, no instinct to override her judgment with his own, only genuine readiness to listen. And Grace felt something ease in her chest at that readiness even as her mind raced through the layout of the farm, the barn, the pond, the low hill behind the house where the family sometimes grazed the milk cow. "Pavel is small and fast and knows every inch of this land better than any of us," Grace said. "He can slip out the back through the corn rows while their attention is on the front of the house, and reach the stage stop faster on foot through the fields than any rider could on the road, because the road loops wide around the marsh and the field path cuts straight. Meanwhile, we make them believe there are more of us here than there are, and that we are prepared for a long siege, so they hesitate to press the attack hard before help can arrive." Pavel is 12 years old, Ainska said sharply from the doorway, understanding enough of the plan through Grace's rapid explanation to object on instinct. He is 12 and he can run like a jackrabbit, and he knows the marsh path better than I do, Grace said, switching briefly into Czech to explain further to her aunt. A rapid, urgent exchange that ended with Ainska's face going tight with fear but her head, finally, nodding. Pavel, for his part, looked more excited than afraid. The particular fearlessness of a boy who has not yet learned all the ways the world can hurt him. And Grace gripped his shoulders hard and made him repeat back the path to the stage stop twice before she let him go, watching him slip out the kitchen's rear window and disappear low and fast into the corn rows, swallowed by darkness within seconds. Now, Grace said, turning back to the two men, we need to look like more than 3 defenders. What followed was as much theater as strategy. Roscoe hauled every lamp and lantern in the house out to the porch in the barn, lighting them and setting them at intervals along the fence line and window sills, so that from a distance in the dark, the homestead blazed with the light of a dozen occupied rooms rather than one small farmhouse. Henrik dragged an old scarecrow frame from the barn and dressed it hastily in his own spare coat and hat, propping it at the corner of the hayloft window where a rifle barrel, real this time, caught the lamplight just enough to suggest a watchful defender. Grace herself changed quickly into her father's old canvas coat, too large for her, and took up position at the second-story window with Henrik's second rifle, her silhouette against the lamplit curtain deliberately made larger and more masculine than her own slim shape would otherwise suggest. By the time the riders came within sight of the farmhouse, reining up at a cautious distance along the fence line, they saw not a lone homestead with 3 defenders but a blazing, watchful compound bristling with apparent riflemen at every window. And Amos Sloane, sitting his horse at the head of the group, a lean, weathered man with a scar through one eyebrow and eyes that had long since stopped registering ordinary human hesitation, called out into the dark with more caution in his voice than he likely intended to show. "Collins, Ford, we know you have been talking to Halloran's people. We know about the ledgers. Hand them over and nobody needs to get hurt tonight." Roscoe, crouched at the corner of the porch with his rifle steady, called back in a voice pitched to carry, deliberately calm, deliberately unhurried, a voice meant to suggest a man entirely unafraid of the numbers arrayed against him. "There are no ledgers here to hand over, Sloane. Copies have already gone out with riders in 3 directions. Killing us tonight buys you nothing but a murder charge to add to the sabotage and the toll fraud once Superintendent Halloran's investigators arrive." This was not entirely true, not yet. The ledgers were still gathered at the Collins farm, and no rider had yet been sent with copies anywhere. But it did not need to be true. It needed only to be believable enough to introduce doubt into the minds of men who had ridden out expecting an easy, cowed surrender rather than a defended position, and a claim of evidence already beyond their reach. There was a pause, a low muttering among the riders, and Grace, watching from the second-story window, saw Sloane turn in his saddle to consult with the man beside him, a thick-set rider she did not recognize, and felt a small, fierce hope kindle in her chest that the bluff might actually hold. "He is lying," the thick-set man said, loud enough to carry. "Ain't no way they got riders out already, not with us watching the roads all evening." "Maybe," Sloane called back toward the house, "and maybe not. Only one way to find out for certain." The riders began to advance, slow and deliberate, spreading out along the fence line to approach from multiple angles, and Roscoe understood with a cold certainty that the bluff had bought them time but not safety, that within minutes these 10 armed men would be close enough to overwhelm the farmhouse's defenses no matter how convincing the lamplight and the scarecrow had seemed from a distance. "Grace," he called up toward the second-story window, "however this unfolds, I need you to know I do not regret one single moment of the past few weeks, whatever happens tonight. Do not you dare speak like a man saying goodbye, Roscoe Ford," Grace called back down, her voice fierce even through the fear plainly audible beneath it. "We are not finished with tonight, and we are certainly not finished with each other." The riders had closed to within 100 yards when the sound came that changed everything. A fresh drumming of hooves from the east, fast and numerous. And for one terrible moment Roscoe feared it was reinforcements for Sloane rather than the help Pavel had run to summon. But then a voice rang out across the dark prairie. A voice Roscoe recognized as belonging to Gunnar Larson, Ingrid's brother-in-law and a freighter well known along the stage line, shouting for Sloane's men to stand down in the name of witnesses now arriving from the Larkin stage stop. And behind Gunnar's voice came the shapes of 6 or 7 more riders. Freighters and hired hands roused from their evening rest by a breathless 12-year-old boy, with a story urgent enough to send them all scrambling for their horses, without a second thought. Sloane's men, who had ridden out expecting to intimidate a lone farm family into silence, found themselves suddenly outnumbered, and worse, witnessed, their faces now visible in the combined lamplight of the farmhouse and the torches the newly arrived riders carried, faces that would be remembered and named if this confrontation turned to violence in front of so many onlookers. "This ain't over, Collins," Sloane called out, his voice tight with the particular fury of a man forced to retreat, "but it is over for tonight." He wheeled his horse and led his riders back toward the toll road at a hard gallop, and the farmhouse erupted into a chaos of relieved shouting and embracing. Ainska running out to gather Pavel into her arms so fiercely the boy laughed despite himself. Henrik pumping Gunnar Larsson's hand, and thanking every rider individually by name, and Roscoe finding Grace at the bottom of the porch steps, her father's oversized coat still hanging from her shoulders. Her face streaked with dust and lamp smoke and something that might have been tears of relief, though she would not have called them that. "You were magnificent," Roscoe said, pulling her into his arms without asking permission first, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his shoulder for one long moment before pulling back enough to look up at him. "We were magnificent," she corrected. "All of us together. That is rather the point I have been trying to make to you, Roscoe Ford, since the day we met at the dam." "I have learned the lesson," he said, and kissed her then, finally, in front of Henrik and Ainska and Pavel and Gunnar Larsson, and half the assembled freighters of the Larkin stage stop, none of whom seemed remotely surprised by the development, and several of whom cheered. The siege had failed to break the Collins family or silence their evidence, but it had also revealed, unmistakably, that Sloane knew about the ledgers and the coming visit from Superintendent Halloran, and that meant time had grown shorter still. In the days that followed, Roscoe and Grace worked with renewed urgency, gathering the last pieces of testimony, securing the ledgers in a locked strongbox at the Larkin stage stop under the watch of Gunnar Larsson and several other freighters who had seen firsthand, now, exactly what kind of men they were dealing with. Word of the failed siege spread quickly along the stage line, and with it spread something else that had been building quietly for months beneath the surface of the community's fear, a willingness, finally, to speak. Families who had paid Sloane's toll in silence for 2 years began coming forward with their own records, their own stories. A hired hand who had once worked briefly for Sloane's outfit came forward with an account of overhearing Sloane and Judge Whitfield discussing the sabotage plan directly. A conversation about the dam and the timing of the supply train that left no room for doubt about the judge's complicity. Marshal Cobb, hearing the shifting winds, suddenly discovered urgent business that required his presence in Omaha for the foreseeable future. A transparent flight that only confirmed everything the gathered evidence already suggested. Superintendent Halloran arrived on schedule 3 weeks after the dam sabotage. A stout, careful man with a lawyer's precision and a railroad man's impatience for corruption that threatened his company's investment. And Roscoe presented him with a case built not from suspicion, but from documentation so thorough and so consistent that Halloran, after 2 days of review, sent an urgent telegram to the federal marshal's office in Omaha requesting immediate intervention. The public reckoning, when it came, unfolded not in a courtroom, but in the most fitting venue the stage stop community possessed. The long common room of the Larkin stage stop itself, where a federal marshal named Whitcomb, sent out on Halloran's telegram with 2 deputies and considerable legal authority, convened an inquiry that half the farms and families of the surrounding prairie turned out to witness, packing the room shoulder to shoulder in a way that had not happened since the community's founding. Grace stood to testify about the sabotage dam, her voice steady even as she described the sawn brace, and the timing calculated to endanger the supply train. Ingrid Larson stood, trembling but resolute, to describe her husband's death at the ford and the marshal's refusal to investigate. Henrik presented the Vaclavics toll ledger alongside a dozen similar records from other families, an unbroken pattern of extortion stretching back 2 years. Roscoe presented his own careful documentation of sabotage along the rail grade, correlated precisely against the ledger's dates, a pattern too exact to be coincidence. Amos Sloan, present in the room under federal guard, sat through this testimony with his jaw tight and his eyes hard. But when Marshal Whitcomb finally turned to the matter of Judge Whitfield's complicity, presenting the hired hand's testimony about the overheard conversation, something in the room's temperature shifted, because Whitfield himself had come to observe the proceedings, apparently believing his official position would shield him from the community's suspicion, and now found himself named directly. In public, before neighbors and farmers and freighters who had trusted his court for years. "This is outrageous," Whitfield began, rising from his seat near the back of the room. "I will not stand here and be slandered by the testimony of a discharged laborer with a grudge." "Sit down, Judge," Marshal Whitcomb said, in a tone that brooked no argument, "or I will have you removed and you can explain your objections from a federal cell in Omaha instead of a chair in this room." Whitfield sat down. The inquiry concluded with Sloan and 3 of his lieutenants placed under federal arrest for sabotage of railroad property, extortion, and complicity in the death of Ingrid Larson's husband, charges that would see them tried in federal court in Omaha with evidence unlikely to leave much room for acquittal. Judge Whitfield was removed from his position pending investigation into his own role in legitimizing Sloan's toll operation. And though Marshal Whitcomb noted that proving corrupt intent in a signed franchise document would prove more difficult than proving sabotage with sawn timber, the community's confidence that justice, however imperfect, was finally arriving, ran high and warm through the packed common room. When the formal proceedings ended and the crowd began to disperse into the golden late afternoon, families embracing, freighters shaking hands, the particular exhausted joy of people who have watched a long injustice finally begin to unravel, Roscoe found Grace standing near the stage stop's porch rail, watching the crowd with an expression of quiet, tired satisfaction. "It is not entirely finished," she said as he came to stand beside her. "Sloan's trial is still to come. The toll road itself will need someone to manage it properly now, someone accountable, or another version of the same trouble will simply grow up in its place." "One thing at a time," Roscoe said. "Today, we have earned the right to simply feel glad, Grace. Tomorrow we can worry about toll roads." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and for a long moment they simply watched the community they had helped protect celebrate its own survival, the specific satisfaction of having acted together when action mattered. In the weeks that followed, as the golden Nebraska summer stretched into its fullest, ripest days, the relationship between Roscoe Ford and Grace Collins deepened into something neither of them troubled to hide any longer. He courted her openly now, with none of the flimsy excuses that had characterized his early visits, riding out simply because he wished to see her, bringing small gifts when he could, a length of good calico from the railhead store for a new dress, a book of poetry he had ordered specially through the mail from a bookseller in Omaha, because she had once mentioned, almost shyly, that she missed her father's habit of reading aloud in the evenings. Their intimacy grew alongside their trust, unhurried but unmistakable, built on the foundation of everything they had already proven to each other through crisis and cooperation. There came an evening, some weeks after the inquiry, when Roscoe arrived at the Collins homestead to find Grace alone on the porch, her mother and Henrik having taken Pavel into the nearest town for supplies, the whole homestead quiet and golden in the long summer evening light. "I have been thinking," Grace said, as he climbed the porch steps and settled beside her, closer now than mere friendship would require, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of established habit, "about what you said that first night after the siege, about not regretting a moment of these past weeks." "I meant every word of it," Roscoe said. "I find I feel the same," Grace said, turning to face him fully, her dark eyes warm in the fading light. "I told you once that I had stopped noticing when the words only passing through became untrue for this land. I think I stopped noticing something else too, somewhere along the way. When did I stop thinking of my heart as something merely passing through your company, Roscoe, and start thinking of it as something that had arrived somewhere it wished to stay?" He answered her not with words but by drawing her close, and this time the kiss between them held none of the public celebration and adrenaline of the night of the siege, but something slower and deeper, an unhurried exploration of a certainty that had been building for weeks and now, finally, in the quiet privacy of a summer evening, found space to fully unfold. Her hands found the collar of his shirt, his found the small of her back, and when they finally drew apart, both a little breathless, both smiling in a way that had nothing guarded left in it, Grace laughed softly. "My mother will return within the hour," she said. "We should perhaps compose ourselves before she finds us like this on her own porch." "Perhaps," Roscoe agreed, though he made no immediate move to release her, "though I suspect your mother has known exactly what has been growing between us for weeks now, and has simply been too polite or too amused to say so directly." "You are likely right," Grace admitted. "She asked me last week, quite bluntly for her, when the railroad man intended to make his intentions formal. I did not know what to tell her." "Tell her," Roscoe said, and here his voice grew serious though his eyes stayed warm, "that the railroad man's intentions are entirely formal and have been for some time, and that he intends to ask her daughter to marry him if her daughter will have him, though he understands that her daughter is a woman who makes her own decisions and will need to arrive at this one in her own time and manner." Grace's breath caught slightly. "Are you asking me now, Roscoe Ford, or informing me of a future intention?" "I am asking you," he said, "right now, plainly, the way you have taught me to say things plainly rather than hiding behind excuses about culverts and water levels. Grace Collins, I love you and I would very much like to marry you if you will have a railroad foreman who has learned, slowly and sometimes clumsily, that loving you well means standing beside you rather than in front of you." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her eyes bright, and when she spoke her voice carried none of its usual careful steadiness, only open, unguarded feeling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Roscoe, I will marry you, though I want it understood from the very start that whatever we build together, this farm, any home we make, any decisions about our future, we build it as partners, the way we defended this house together, the way we gathered evidence together. I will not be a wife who waits at home while her husband rides off toward every danger alone, and I think, having watched you these past weeks, that you would not truly want such a wife regardless." "I would not," Roscoe agreed. "I have learned that lesson thoroughly, Grace, and I do not intend to forget it. Whatever comes, we face it side by side." They were married 3 weeks later, in the last golden days of that Nebraska summer, in a modest ceremony at the Larkin stage stop, attended by nearly the whole surrounding community. Henrik giving away the bride he had come to think of as a daughter, Ainska weeping proud tears throughout, Pavel serving self-importantly as ring-bearer, and taking the responsibility with a solemnity that made half the assembled guests laugh despite themselves. Gunnar Larson and Ingrid Larson stood among the witnesses, and Superintendent Halloran, who had taken a genuine liking to both Roscoe and Grace during the inquiry, sent his congratulations along with a generous gift toward the rebuilding of the dam's damaged brace, a permanent repair this time, done properly and inspected thoroughly, with no hidden saw marks left to threaten it again. In the months that followed the trial in Omaha, Amos Sloan and his lieutenants were convicted on the federal charges of sabotage and extortion, sentences that would keep them away from the toll road at Ash Hollow for years to come. Judge Whitfield resigned his position rather than face the fuller investigation into his complicity, and the territory appointed a new judge, a careful, honest man from Kearney named Judge Merrick, who moved swiftly to revoke Sloan's toll franchise entirely and establish, instead, a proper county-maintained road with fair, published rates that any traveler could verify and any family could afford. The Ash Hollow crossing, once a chokepoint of fear and extortion, became instead simply a crossing again, its swinging chain gate torn down and replaced with an honest bridge, funded jointly by the county and by the Union Pacific in recognition of the community's role in exposing the corruption that had threatened both the railroad and the settlers alike. When that new bridge was finally completed, in the early autumn following that eventful summer, the whole community gathered for its opening, much as they had once gathered in fear at the Collins homestead during the siege, but this time gathered in celebration. Roscoe Ford stood on that new bridge beside his wife, watching the first wagons cross freely, without toll, without fear, farmers and freighters alike moving south toward the railhead at Kearney with the easy confidence of people who no longer had to calculate what price might be extracted from them along the way. Grace Collins Ford, her hand resting easily in her husband's, watched the same crossing with a satisfaction that ran deeper than mere relief, the particular satisfaction of a woman who had come to this country with nothing but her father's rifle and her mother's Bible and had built, alongside the man beside her and the family who had welcomed him into their fold, something that would outlast them both, a road made honest, a crossing made safe, a community made stronger for having faced its fear and refused to be driven from the land it had claimed as its own. "You never did make it across this river the day we met," Roscoe said, watching the water flow clean and unimpeded beneath the new bridge's timbers he had personally inspected for any hint of sabotage and found, gladly, entirely sound. "You said you were only riding through to check the dam, and I do not believe you ever did complete that particular crossing you must have originally intended, before I found so many reasons to keep you talking to me instead." Grace laughed, the sound bright and easy in the autumn air. "I was not trying to cross the river that day, Roscoe Ford, only to save the bridge above it, but I understand your meaning. You have been keeping me from crossing rivers, one way and another, ever since that first afternoon, always with some reason or another that seemed urgent at the time. And do you regret it?" he asked, though he already knew her answer, could see it in the easy warmth of her expression, the way she leaned into him without hesitation, a woman entirely at home in her own choices. "I have crossed exactly the river I needed to cross," Grace said, "the one that carried me from thinking of myself as only passing through this land, to knowing myself as someone who belongs here, fully, alongside the man who taught me that being protected and being equal were never actually opposite things, so long as the protecting went both directions." Below them, the water ran on toward Kearney and the railhead beyond, carrying with it the last of that golden summer's light, and the bridge held steady beneath their feet, built honest and true, the way they had built everything else between them, evidence gathered together, danger faced together, a home and a future chosen together, equal partners standing at the center of a community they had helped save, with the whole wide amber prairie stretching out around them, and nothing ahead of them now but the clear, open road of the life they had chosen to build side by side. They walked back across the bridge together as the sun began its long slide toward evening, past the wagons and the freighters and the families crossing freely at last, past Henrik and Ainska waiting with Pavel near the bridge's northern end, past Ingrid Larson and Gunnar, and the dozens of neighbors who had become, over that eventful summer, something closer to family than mere community. Roscoe Ford and Grace Collins Ford walked home together in the golden light, not passing through anymore, not anywhere, but arrived, finally and completely, exactly where they both belonged,